So Perrin and Egwene. So Perrin starts out fleeing the trolls from Shadar Logoth. He's riding his horse, and he gets unhorsed near the river, falls into the river, swims across. He's exhausted. He also loses his horse. And he starts searching for Egwene. He believes that Egwene is maybe somewhat troubled, and he's the one that's going to need to persevere. And yet, he has a decent plan to look for. He assumes that maybe she was the weaker swimmer, so he follows the river downstream, and it works. He comes across Egwene, and yet he finds her faring better than him. Right? She's eating food and has a fire going. Not to mention she's actually saved her horse, which is kind of interesting. He lost his horse, and to his credit, he's quick to admit that Egwene's doing very well. And so they're talking, and he suggests this plan of bypassing Whitebridge and heading straight for Camelin in order to throw off any would-be trackers. Perrin's actually impressed that Egwene accepts his idea and finds it worthwhile. And we get this line. He expected she would take charge. She was always bullying him into something, and that was all right with him. I get the sense that in this moment is when he expects that he can be a leader. Like, this moment gives him hope. I think before this, he was just going to resign himself to Egwene taking charge, and I think he fully expected her to counter his suggestion. He doesn't want to be a leader. He's sort of thrust into the responsibility of being one. So this romanticized form of being a leader, and it's noble, which everyone can kind of get behind. And I also get the sense that he's used to Rand, Mat, and especially Egwene and Nynaeve being assertive, and he's reticent around them. We saw that earlier. He's relegated to being a follower. In contrast to Egwene, who was trained to be a wisdom, so she's more used to giving orders, asserting herself. They're both learning from each other. Perrin's learning to be more confident, and they're going to have to find an appropriate balance between the two. We see that Egwene can, in fact, be a bit overbearing. So they're speaking to one another, and Egwene constantly interjects his speech with unfounded accusations about his intentions. So she kind of does come across, which later Perrin will accuse her of being a bully. But after he devises and relays his plan, he asks for more food. And I thought when I read this, when she's telling him this, she seems fairly compassionate. It's not like she's just being rude to him. But Perrin thinks this. Apparently there were limits to how much leadership she was willing to accept. So rationing food actually seems like it might be the wise choice considering their circumstances. Ultimately, he contrives no cogent rebuttal to what she's said. Perrin thinks that disagreement with Egwene reflects her bullying attitude. By refusing to admit that Egwene's idea is rather good and that he is wrong, Perrin comes across as stubborn, which he just doesn't see. In another instance, he rejects her idea to stay by the fire. He just hops up from the fire and he just leaves and he forces her to follow. And once again, this here seemed to me wrong. There was no discussion on his part. There was no planning. And the most important thing about this to consider is how he was still wet. And earlier in chapter 22, he was described as shivering in the wind. And my question is, like, why did he do this? And well, I think he did it to further assert his leadership, to assert his position. And he thinks this: if he was the leader, it was time to start leading. And then the next sentence literally tells us that it was getting colder at that moment. The wind from the river was picking up. You can't help but ask, well, wouldn't have remaining by the fire a little longer have been the wise choice? Even just a little bit? Moments later, Egwene tells us this: but you're still wet, she protested, and that's also in chapter 22. I don't think he realized it by just up and leaving, that he thinks he's being fair, that he's asserting himself. The problem is he just assumes that when he does it, he's always correct. I think he kind of has a tendency to justify his intentions right away. But he assumes that whenever any idea of his is countermanded by Egwene, or whenever she asserts herself like he's just done, well, she's a bully. But when Perrin does it, he's being a leader. At some point later, Egwene suggests they should alternate riding Bella so they don't get too tired. To which Perrin replies, well, I'm used to walking. Egwene parries with, and I'm not. And to this response, Perrin resorts to the tired old, well, that's not what I meant. This is the same situation that Rand often finds himself in with Egwene. But I think Egwene meant, at least in one careful interpretation is that it would be prudent to avoid exhaustion or fatiguing ourselves from overwalking. Right? Had he said, I won't get tired because of so-and-so reason, or had some rationale for not riding Bella the horse, that would have been a better route to take. But once again, he offers no credible argument to dissuade her from the approach that she's offered. And as before, Perrin will interpret his own stubbornness as leadership and Egwene's stubbornness as bullying. And she does get stubborn, it's true, but so does Perrin, which is what he misses. And I do think she was probably correct here. So he does accept, but he tells her, you're going to ride first. And instead of giving her the chance to speak, he just talks over her. And this talking over is kind of important because Perrin sees talking over people as a battleground for what defines leadership. It'll be important later. And I do think, once again, it's probably not that true. Maybe in some circumstances. As he's talking over her, right, he's asserting himself while he's submitting to her plan. But I do think this is important, for both of them, right? There's this balance occurring. But even when his idea is countermanded, he still takes pains to assert himself. And on the converse side, Egwene still, even when someone submits to her idea, she still approaches it from this kind of mocking perspective. So he pledges to put her on the horse if she refuses to ride Bella first. And it is kind of funny, to which she does smile. And I think perhaps Egwene understands what's happening here. That Perrin didn't like being wrong, so he became recalcitrant. And although he acquiesced to her demands, he stubbornly talked over her. And moments later, Perrin thinks to himself, leaders in stories never had to put up with these sorts of things. So he's just sort of further entrenching himself in his belief system, that he's right, Egwene is a bully for overpowering him and resisting his great ideas, even though ultimately she has accepted his main idea, which is driving their travel, right? Bypassing Whitebridge and going to Camelin. And I do think this is somewhat telling. Perrin believes that leaders are never told what to do. And he conflates listening and acceptance, and once again, staying by the fire, rationing the food, on his part with being bullied. And this is their point of contention. There's another point that's interesting where he gets exasperated with Egwene for using the one power to start a fire. I think he's probably right here. And though she consents to Perrin's demand that she refrained from using it for the night, she does, it seems, doggedly refuse to do so in the following days, even though it's the dangerous thing to be doing, not as much of a novice as she is. But there is an interesting line that'll come back and have importance later. Egwene says this: would you give up that axe of yours, Perrin? Would you walk around with one hand tied behind your back? I won't do it. Here she is being stubborn. And I would say, yeah, a bully. But once again, that doesn't make her always a bully, nor does it make Perrin never a bully. He confuses his stubbornness for good ideas and her assertiveness for bullying. It is interesting, though, that Perrin will later come to see the axe as a major source of his problems, believing, just like he believes of Egwene right now, that she's becoming too attached to something which is unnatural and dangerous. His original plan to journey straight to Camelin by circumventing Whitebridge and going straight to Camelin, which is an adroit plan, so his confidence begins to waver. And he keeps expecting Egwene to blame him, because I think he just thinks she's a bully. Like, that's it. She's a bully. But I think what's happening is his own diffidence is being projected here onto Egwene. Just like later, he'll project, at least I think, his own fears and anxiety about fighting onto others. So Perrin here is, I think, learning not just to assert himself, but to live with decisions he's committed to. And to contrast this with Egwene, she seems to be fine with making decisions and living with them. But she's now learning to live with the decisions that others have made, and she's learning to follow. So they're still traveling in the forest, and Perrin starts having dreams of Belzamon. He won't seek counsel on his dreams with Egwene because he believes that would make him appear weak and threaten her ability to feel safe. And we get this line: She was looking to him to lead them safely to Camelin, not share worries about which they could do nothing. First thing, he just keeps assuming that Egwene expects him to lead. I think this is his justification to assume the leadership role, and I think it's wrong, because I find it strangely contradictory that Perrin believes that Egwene would want him to lead, considering that she was the one training to be a wisdom, to be a leader. And considering the fact that he constantly accuses her of being a bully and trying to lead. I do wonder, to some degree, if the reason he thinks this is because he assumes he needs to persevere because he's strong, and if part of him views Egwene as maybe weak. And so we're starting to get a sense of what his leadership belief system is. He thinks leaders are solitary, without allies. They never take advice. And as we saw earlier, to some degree, he doesn't think that they're ever wrong. So he very much has a romanticized view of leadership, acutely believing that he must take charge, and I think this romanticized complex is why he overlooks his own stubbornness. And just to emphasize it, where again do I think Perrin was being stubborn? Well, when he just abruptly leaves the fire and forces Egwene to follow, and then 2, when he somewhat sulks at Egwene for choosing to ration the food. And then also 3, when he just starts this argument with Egwene about riding Bella, even though he doesn't have a decent rebuttal for that. Also, he seems to miss that she very quickly accepted his plans to go straight to Camelin. So let's talk about rabbits. So they smell a cooking rabbit in the forest. Egwene's intuition, her first intuition, is to bound off and approach. So Perrin's kind of like, well, stay put, be quiet, and then he slinks off to cautiously investigate. And he thinks this, there were responsibilities to being a leader. So she accepts his advice. The obvious reason I think that she accepts his advice is because she knows he's right. He is absolutely right. And we get this line. She nodded, reluctantly, but she did it. Perrin wondered why that did not work when he was trying to make her take his turn riding. So he's wondering why she didn't protest this idea. Once again, the obvious reason is just that he's right. Just like with his good idea about circumventing Whitebridge and traveling straight to Camelin. And because she knows he's right, she thought about it and then acquiesced. Perrin doesn't like this rationale because I think he subsumes every one of her actions within the mindset of a bully. I think he assumes, though, that she's too scared to investigate. At least that's the sense I gather. And therefore, because she's afraid, she thrusts the leadership responsibility onto him because of her timidity. Once again, this seems slightly contradictory if this is Perrin's reasoning, because she was about to merrily frolic off and announce her presence to whoever was there. Hey, I think it's better to assume in this situation caution was the appropriate response and Perrin was correct, and Egwene realized this rather than her just not wanting to accept responsibility or being too frightened to accept responsibility, which is sort of what I gather Perrin believes of Egwene. To sum up this scene with these two characters, what I saw happening is that ultimately Perrin is learning what it's like to assert oneself and to be an actual leader, but there are problems with his reasonings. First off, Perrin thinks that responsibility and leadership are these ideas that Egwene accepts and rejects at whim. Also, if he wants to be a leader so much, as so many quotes of his indicate, why does he complain at all when Egwene gives him that responsibility? Isn't that what he's trying to attain the whole time? And then conversely, if he doesn't want that responsibility, he often does become agitated when Egwene thrusts it on him, or so he believes she thrusts it on him. Why does he care then when Egwene does assume responsibility? Next, why does he even think the leadership role is his alone to have, but not Egwene's? So I think he's internalized this mindset where he's not responsible for his bad ideas, but Egwene is. He's not responsible for his stubbornness, which he often overlooks, but Egwene is. Egwene is also learning to heed advice here because her system is sort of all over the place as well. For instance, her first reaction at the smell of the rabbit is to carelessly investigate, which is not appropriate in their situation. And then, not to mention, she does stubbornly keep trying to use the one power. So stubbornness does factor into her leadership response as well. But I think Egwene is learning to accept when others have good ideas to relinquish this old wisdom training, to comply with demands of leadership other than herself, right? For instance, she's forced to comply when Perrin just strides away from the fire, or when he refuses to sit on the horse, and when he speaks over her after he does comply. So ultimately, I think she's learning to listen. And this was interesting. I kind of felt like this adventure that they're having was a bit like a young amateur Lon and Moraine traveling together. And I did wonder as I was reading it if they will eventually be bound. So in the next scene, they approach the cooking rabbits and they encounter a hunter named Elias. They sit down with Elias and they're eating, and his wolf pack just rolls up. So he can communicate with wolves, and he's making these preposterous claims that Perrin can do the same as well. So he wants to know, how did they end up here? So they tell this story. Perrin and Egwene have agreed that Egwene will tell this lie. So she starts lying, and Elias knows. Well, the wolves know, and they tell him. They're sort of stupefied when he calls them out for lying. So Egwene looks to Perrin, and Perrin is just aghast that Egwene would look to him. This is what he thinks. Lie. Suddenly, I'm the leader again? Once again, he's just haughtily assuming that Egwene is thrusting responsibility to himself when she can't handle it. And we also see, I think, that even though Perrin romanticizes leadership and wants to be the leader the whole time, as so many of his lines above indicate, he's sort of just reluctant to ever accept it. He goes through this whole plot process right here. Oh, I'm the leader again? It seems like a blaming Egwene when leadership is needed, or maybe teamwork is needed. Because the way I read this scene was that she's probably just as confused as he is. They should sort of be allies here. There were a few things that I found interesting in the aftermath of Elias accusing them of lying. It's not like Egwene just immediately looks to Perrin for something to do. She's already tried to calm Elias. Perrin has already reached for his axe and provoked the wolves, and they all sort of rise when he touches his axe. Also, before telling the truth, Perrin thinks again that he should reach for his axe, but the wolves being in his mind anticipate this reaction and cancel that action because he realizes I should not do this. So they tried something together. So it's interesting that Perrin felt like he was being thrust responsibility here. So I think that's where I'll cut this one off today. Peace.